The conference room was suffocating with tension. It was as though the very walls absorbed the nervous energy crackling among the employees, each aware that their jobs and the company's future hung by a thread. The boss, a man feared for his sharp tongue and explosive temper, paced the front of the room, his steely eyes darting over his employees. Silence stretched across the room as he looked at each of them, his frustration practically radiating off him. The company was failing. 3 straight months in the red, and rumors of bankruptcy were spreading. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned to face the group, his expression cold and unreadable. "I didn't bring you all here just to look at me," he snapped, voice cutting through the silence. "If we don't fix this now, we're finished. I need real solutions, not the same recycled ideas." His gaze drilled into them as he let the words hang in the air, his tone a dare. No one dared to move, much less speak. Just then, a voice cut through the silence. It was Sarah, a black woman known for her sharp intellect and unshakable confidence. She had saved the company from close calls in the past, but today, as she cleared her throat and spoke up, the atmosphere shifted. Sarah's calm, steady voice began laying out a plan, meticulously thought out and based on sharp insight. She went over each point with precision, explaining how this strategy could potentially pull the company out of the red and turn things around. Her proposal was logical, effective, even visionary. But instead of admiration, Sarah's words were met with a wave of mocking laughter. It was a hollow, jealous laughter, a laughter that stung. Sarah's peers, people she had worked alongside for years, sneered and chuckled, casting glances at one another. Sarah's calm faltered for a moment, her surprise obvious. Here she was, sharing a plan that could genuinely save them all, yet they responded with laughter, belittling her simply because her brilliance threatened them. The boss's face darkened as he watched, his irritation growing. Without warning, he shot up from his seat, fury blazing in his eyes. "You think this is a joke?" he roared, slamming his fist on the table. The laughter immediately died down as everyone fell silent, shrinking under his rage. He turned his glare to Sarah, his tone bitter. "Are you trying to embarrass me in my own company?" he demanded. Sarah's heart pounded, but she held her ground, looking him straight in the eye. "No," she replied evenly. "I believe this is our best option." But the boss was beyond reason. His anger flared even hotter, and with a harshness that shocked everyone, he hissed, "You're fired! Get out!" The room was silent, employees frozen, unsure of what to think. Sarah felt the sting of the boss's words, but she stayed composed. She looked at him steadily and spoke with calm determination. "One day," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "you'll regret this." She left, the silence in the room heavy as her words lingered. 2. A bold voice, amid the jealous crowd. As Sarah walked out of the conference room, she could feel the weight of their stares pressing against her back. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she kept her steps even, her expression calm. The humiliation still simmered beneath the surface, but she refused to let it show. Her idea had been the one true solution, and in her gut she knew it. Yet that knowledge didn't make the sting any less sharp. As she made her way through the silent hallways, every step echoing in the stillness, she repeated her parting words to herself, "You'll regret this." It was not a wish, but a certainty, a truth that had already begun to weave itself into the future. Inside the conference room, an awkward silence lingered in her absence, thick and suffocating. The employees exchanged uneasy glances, some feigning indifference, while others looked down at their notepads as if Sarah's exit hadn't rattled them. The boss, who had returned to his seat, scanned the room with an air of triumph, as though he had just rid his company of a pest. But in the flicker of his eyes there was something darker, a hint of discomfort that he was too proud to admit. Sarah's words lingered, looping in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. You'll regret this." The certainty in her voice unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated, but he quickly brushed it off. One of the employees, Richard, let out a forced chuckle, attempting to break the tension. "Well," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those around him to hear, "guess she finally ran out of genius ideas." A ripple of laughter followed, hesitant at first, but then growing louder as others joined in. It was the kind of laughter that masked their own insecurities, a nervous release after watching someone with so much intelligence be so effortlessly dismissed. They had all heard her proposal, but envy and fear had twisted their reactions. After all, Sarah's sharp mind had always been a quiet threat, an unspoken reminder that she could outshine them at any moment. Another voice, softer and hesitant, chimed in. "Did you hear what she said?" It was Claire, one of the more junior employees who looked unsettled. "She said he'd regret firing her. I don't know, something about the way she said it." She cut herself off, catching a disapproving look from the boss. The room went silent again. It was clear that any further discussion of Sarah was off limits. The boss's gaze held them all in place, daring anyone to challenge him. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he looked out over his loyal employees, his chosen circle, the ones who hadn't dared to question him. "Well, any more ideas?" he asked, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Or do we need more so-called brilliance like Sarah's?" Another chuckle rippled through the room, but the humor was thin, a mask barely hiding their nervousness. Each person in that room knew deep down that Sarah's idea had been the best they'd heard in months. Yet they clung to their pride, clinging to the belief that the boss's decision was the right one. After all, it was easier to agree with him than risk becoming the next target of his temper. Meanwhile, Claire shifted in her seat, glancing toward the door where Sarah had disappeared. Her heart still raced from witnessing the scene. She respected Sarah, everyone did, even if they rarely admitted it. Sarah had a way of cutting through the noise and seeing solutions no one else could. And today, her idea had been the best hope they'd had. But loyalty to the boss was paramount, and Claire couldn't afford to question him. Not now. The boss, sensing the silence settling back in, finally straightened up. "Good. Now that we've weeded out the distractions, let's get back to business," he said, his tone final. He gestured toward the whiteboard, where the employees' suggestions were scribbled in messy handwriting. With Sarah gone, he was free to pick from the safer, more conventional ideas, the ones that didn't challenge him, the ones that wouldn't make him feel threatened. But as the meeting droned on, the tension didn't quite fade. There was an unspoken awareness in the room, a sense that something vital had been lost the moment Sarah walked out. 3. Fired for her courage. Sarah's footsteps echoed in the empty corridors as she left the office for the last time. She held her head high, but her mind was racing, replaying the scene from the conference room. She had given that company everything, her time, her energy, and her best ideas, all to be dismissed in an instant. And for what? For speaking the truth? She shook her head, steeling herself against the sting of it all. If they couldn't see her value, it was their loss. Her last words to the boss echoed in her mind with a sense of finality. "You'll regret this." She had said it calmly, but with a conviction that she knew had unsettled him, even if he'd never admit it. Inside the office, the meeting dragged on, but it was clear that Sarah's absence had left an unfillable void. Her peers pretended to ignore it, throwing out half-baked ideas that were met with thin nods from the boss, who seemed increasingly restless. His mind kept wandering back to Sarah's words, her unwavering confidence, as she'd stood up to him in front of everyone. It bothered him, that flash of defiance. She had looked at him with an almost knowing expression, as if she could see a future he couldn't yet grasp. It was a look that had unnerved him more than he'd like to admit. Days turned into weeks, and with Sarah gone, The company limped forward on the weak ideas approved in that fateful meeting. The boss tried to push her out of his mind, but as the numbers came in, his irritation grew. Profits continued to plummet, customers complained, and contracts they'd relied on began to slip through their fingers. At first, he ignored the signs, but soon it became impossible to deny. Sarah had been right. Her proposal had been the only real chance they'd had. The strategies he'd chosen instead were failing spectacularly, leaving the company floundering. The employees started to notice, too, their initial confidence slipping. They muttered among themselves, casting nervous glances at the boss during meetings, wondering if anyone would acknowledge the glaring truth. Claire, especially, felt the weight of Sarah's absence. The office felt different without her. The sharpness, the drive, the spark of innovation that had once been there was gone. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a grave mistake. 4. Following the wrong advice. Despite the clear signs of failure, the boss clung stubbornly to his pride, refusing to admit that dismissing Sarah had been a mistake. He doubled down on the advice of the remaining employees, convincing himself that his choices were justified, that he didn't need her. Each day he pushed for more of the safe strategies suggested in that infamous meeting, the strategies that had seemed easy and agreeable, the ones he'd chosen over Sarah's bold proposal. But these choices were slowly strangling the company, one bad decision at a time. The sales team struggled to keep clients, their pitches sounding weak without the innovative spark Sarah had always infused into their strategies. Financial reports arrived with glaring losses, and it became painfully clear that their current direction was unsustainable. The boss, however, only grew more irritable, snapping at his employees and piling on impossible demands in a desperate attempt to salvage the sinking ship. The office atmosphere had transformed from tense to unbearable, with employees tiptoeing around him, whispering about the company's slow collapse in hushed tones. Morale plummeted. Departments that had once thrived under Sarah's leadership now seemed adrift, directionless and discouraged. Claire, along with a few others, quietly questioned whether Sarah's idea would have worked, but nobody dared say it out loud. Fear of the boss's wrath kept them silent, though the truth lingered like a shadow over every meeting, every report, every failed project. They all saw it, they all felt it. The company was unraveling because of one man's stubborn pride, a pride that had led him to fire the person who could have saved them. Months passed, and the losses piled higher. The once bustling office was now a ghost town, with employees leaving in search of more stable jobs. Rumors swirled that the company was on the brink of bankruptcy. Clients began pulling their contracts, competitors swooped in to claim lost business, and whispers of imminent layoffs spread through the office like wildfire. And through it all, the boss watched his company crumble, his expression growing darker and more desperate with each passing day. But even then, he wouldn't admit that his decision to fire Sarah had set this chain of events into motion. It wasn't until the company was beyond saving, until it was a hollow shell of its former self, that he finally understood the weight of her last words. The fall of the boss. As the company's losses mounted, the boss faced a harsh reality. He was running out of time, resources, and options. The bank began calling about missed payments, pressing him for answers about the large loan he had taken to keep the business afloat. He had gambled everything on this company, his reputation, his finances, even his property. But as his risky decisions backfired, the walls closed in. The boss, once feared for his fiery temper and unwavering control, was now scrambling to keep his own life from unraveling. The office had grown eerily quiet, the remaining employees working in near silence, each of them wondering if today would be their last day. Empty desks scattered throughout the floor served as reminders of those who had left, their absence underscoring the company's grim reality. Rumors swirled that the business was nearing its final days, that bankruptcy was not a matter of if, but when. The boss watched this decline in silence, his once commanding presence now diminished to a tired, haunted man, weighed down by his own pride and poor decisions. It wasn't long before the worst came to pass. In a final act of desperation, he sold his personal property, but it wasn't enough. The company declared bankruptcy, and creditors claimed what little remained. The boss was left with nothing, no company, no assets, no future. Word spread quickly. Colleagues who once feared him now watched with grim satisfaction as he fell from grace. The man who had once wielded so much power was now just another victim of his own ego. Now out of work, he roamed the city, moving from interview to interview, looking for someone who would give him a chance. But his reputation had already preceded him, and doors that were once open now closed firmly in his face. He found himself wandering the streets, ashamed and defeated, carrying the weight of every mistake he'd made. In the quiet of his solitude, Sarah's parting words echoed relentlessly in his mind. "You'll regret this." Then, one day, he learned of a new company, the most successful and rapidly growing business in the city. Desperate for a fresh start, he applied for a position, hoping his experience could buy him a second chance. He walked into the building, nerves prickling as he prepared for the interview that could change everything. But as he entered the boardroom, his heart stopped. There, seated at the head of the table, was Sarah. 6. A moment of reckoning. The boss's face drained of color as he locked eyes with Sarah, seated confidently at the head of the table. She looked poised, powerful, and undeniably in control, the complete opposite of the man he had become. The years had been kind to her. There was a calm strength about her now, a quiet authority that made it clear she was more than just a member of this company. She was leading it, steering it to success. And she hadn't lost her edge. The boss, caught entirely off guard, felt a wave of shame wash over him. The memory of that fateful day, the laughter, his anger, her unwavering expression as she'd told him he'd regret firing her, all of it came rushing back. He could barely look at her. He wanted to speak, to find some excuse for his actions, some way to explain the choices that had led him here. But words failed him, his mind racing as he stood frozen in place, realizing how fully his pride had cost him. Sarah didn't look away. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, a complex mixture of understanding and pity in her eyes. She seemed to study him for a moment, taking in the worn, humbled man he had become. Finally she spoke, her voice calm and controlled. "I remember the last time we spoke," she began, her tone almost gentle. "I told you that you'd regret firing me, and here we are." The silence in the room was deafening as the weight of her words sank in. The boss swallowed, feeling smaller than he ever had before. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to plead for a second chance. He knew now, painfully and fully, that his ego had destroyed everything. But Sarah didn't wait for him to speak. With a single graceful gesture, she invited him to sit down. "You're here for a position, I assume?" she asked, her tone professional. Though a hint of something, perhaps justice, perhaps compassion, glimmered in her eyes. The boss nodded, his voice barely a whisper as he replied, "Yes." He knew that his fate was in her hands. Lesson of the story. In the end, the tale of Sarah and her former boss serves as a poignant reminder that true strength lies not just in intelligence or position, but in the courage to stand up for oneself and others, even in the face of adversity. It teaches us that pride can blind us to the brilliance of those around us, leading to choices that can cost us dearly. The wounds of humiliation and regret often come not from the failures of others, but from our own inability to recognize and nurture the potential in those we deem inferior. In Sarah's journey, we see that resilience can triumph over ignorance. and that sometimes the strongest among us are the ones who rise after being pushed down. When she stood her ground against mockery and injustice, she not only reclaimed her voice, but became a beacon of hope for others who felt voiceless. Her former boss's journey from power to humility is a powerful testament to the importance of listening and learning. It reminds us that every setback can be a stepping stone toward redemption, and that true leaders inspire those around them rather than diminish them. As tears fill our eyes, we reflect on the profound truth that every ending can lead to a new beginning. The hardest lessons often come wrapped in the most painful experiences, teaching us that the greatest victories come from within. It is never too late to change, to grow, and to recognize the value of every voice, no matter how quiet it may seem. In the delicate balance of life, we learn that pride can lead to downfall, while humility can open doors to endless possibilities. The story of Sarah is not just her triumph, but a universal call to honor and uplift one another, reminding us that we rise by lifting others, and that true success is measured not by our individual accomplishments, but by the strength of our community.